Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And also check out our Patreon page. I'll put a link below. On Patreon, you're going to get the ability to get exclusive content, reviews that haven't been released yet, and also a discount code for 15% off of everything in our online web store. Hi, I'm Mike, owner of the In-Groove in Phoenix, Arizona. Today I want to talk to you about a very controversial topic: Japanese pressings versus pressings from around the world. Anytime you start talking about something is better than something else, it's going to draw a lot of ire from a crowd of people. But I want to talk about Japanese pressings in particular. A lot of people have noticed in my comparison videos, I'm not a huge fan of Japanese pressings. And I kind of want to talk about the reasons for that today. First, I'll start off with the good aspects of Japanese pressings. And I think this is what kind of lures a lot of people in. This is a copy of Pink Floyd's Animals, US pressing and the Japanese first pressing. The one thing that Japanese records are extremely well made, and that is very well known. Their attention to detail is fantastic. The quality of cardboard they use is fantastic. The quality of vinyl they use is fantastic. It's clean, it's quiet. You can really tell that they're record guys making these records. I mean, the pride is unlike no place else in the world. Heavy, thick cardboard jacket, really beautiful colors versus typically cheaper, crappier, brown cardboard covers in a lot of cases versus nice white cardboard. I mean, much higher quality. Just the absolute, and I mean, it's unbelievable the quality of this cover versus this one. Just the weight on this is about 2 to 3 times more of what the US pressing is. You get a beautiful artwork in the obi strip. That's this band here. All Japanese records for the most part came with them. That sash typically had a lot of nice artwork on it, or it just looks cool, especially if you're from an American audience. You look at the US pressing, it's cheap, crappier cardboard, it wears out. It's just not to the quality of the Japanese. Also, when it comes to the vinyl, especially that oil crisis vinyl from the 70s and the early 80s, the quality of the Japanese stuff is just unbelievably good in comparison to the stuff that we were making here in the States. So the quality yields a much, much lower noise floor. A lot quieter, less popping and clicking. Also, one of the things you're going to notice is the Japanese took excellent care of their records. It is really, really hard to find, and I've bought in plenty of collections from people out of Japan. Even a collection that wasn't well taken care of is significantly better than average for a collection of what you'd find here in the States. They really took care of their items over there. You could tell they love it. They didn't abuse it. They weren't piling them up on record changers. You just don't see the things that you see on American records. You don't see the abuse. I don't think these records were left in people's sheds and garages and attics and discarded, and there was a lot more pride and ownership there. So these records have held up better over the time. To just see something like a small obi on records that are 50, 60, 70 years old, a thin little piece of paper. A lot of those Japanese records still retain this. A lot of the inserts that were extras, with the Japanese records, this is obviously something you're not going to get in an American pressing. This stuff is retained on a lot of those Japanese records. It's so hard to get inserts and posters on US pressings compared to, they're out there. You get an album like Dark Side of the Moon. There's enough copies out there. You're going to find posters and stickers. But you're going to find almost every copy of a Japanese record has inserts with it. I mean, very seldomly did that stuff get removed from the record. So the whole package is significantly nicer. The quality of vinyl is significantly nicer. The noise floor is lower. But let's talk about the stuff that, in my opinion, is not nearly as good. And the sound quality being number one. You got to think, a lot of these American bands, UK bands, when they cut this record, you know, a master tape is a precious thing, and you wouldn't stick it with the post office or FedEx. You don't fly this tape all around the world. So a lot of manufacturers would make copies of the master tape, and those copies would go to plants around the world, and they would cut lacquers and make records from copies. The thing is with Japanese records is they're EQ'd significantly different. They're mastered for that audience over there. And you are going to find significantly lower, no, this is a generalization across the board. You're going to find significantly lower bass levels, and you're going to find much higher and brighter upper end. Your treble is boosted on these records. Very, very, very common. I don't know if it's because, you know, they're living in tight quarters over there. You know, they don't have these big McMansions like we have in the United States, to where, you know, your next door neighbor might be, you know, 500 feet to each side of you. But the bass is significantly cut on most Japanese records. The treble is significantly boosted. And that kind of messes with the flow of the record. So, you know, you got to think, when a band is recording this album, they kind of have a certain way they want it to sound. And when it is mastered and it's cut, a lot of times the band has input on whether or not they release that record to market. You know, they listen to that final lacquer, that, you know, whether it's an acetate, or they listen to that final mix and they sign off on it. And they typically do that for, you know, if it's a US band, they typically are going to do that for a US market. I don't know if these bands are signing off on the sound of every mastering from every plant around the world. I just don't think that was one of their main focuses. So, you know, when you get a record that's a Japanese record, the mastering is just really off compared to a US pressing or a UK pressing. I just notice more times than not, and I'm for the most part talking about rock and roll records now, you're noticing on rock records, you just got much more lower end, much more thrust, much more drive. The problem is when you start messing with the EQ curve and you start boosting something or cutting something, it kind of exaggerates other parts of the mix. And it just doesn't flow right. It kind of messes with the flow. It's a kind of an ironic thing, though, too, when you talk about Japanese records. So, our store is in Phoenix. So we get a lot of the stores from Japan. You know, it's big business over there. Vinyl records in Japan are big business. The vinyl record stores there send teams of people to the United States looking for records. And they're not looking for Japanese records to take back home. They work in crews. 3-4 people will come into a store. And now keep in mind, this is very common in LA, but you see it in Phoenix as well, especially, you know, the largest United States show is in Austin, Texas. So right along the I-10 where we're located, you'll find a lot of these Japanese buyers they'll do a route in LA, stop at Phoenix, make their way to the show in Austin. So there's a few times a year where I'll get a splurge of Japanese, stores who are coming in teams looking for records to bring back to Japan. And it's kind of funny talking to them. And this is very, very common in jazz records. I was talking to a gentleman who is kind of a lead buyer, and I won't say the name of the company, but it's a major, it's a chain in Japan. And he was laughing at the fact that Americans, and now this is in their view, Americans are giving away what they consider prize-sounding records. This is what everybody over there wants. The Japanese want American pressings. They want American pressing rock records, and they definitely want American pressing jazz records. And he was laughing how they're able to bring over with them from Japan and what their view is low-quality Japanese records and offload them on us, and they're coming and pilfering all of our US pressings and bringing it back home. Many times I've had that similar conversation with Japanese buyers, and they get a chuckle out of it. You know, especially when it comes to jazz. They want American Blue Notes and American Prestige and American Impulse. They don't want the Japanese pressings. No way. I mean, that's amateur hour for them over there. They want the US. They know what they're buying. You know, the Japanese, as opposed to the United States, they've been fanatical about home audio for 50 years, and that hasn't stopped. I mean, it's still going strong. You know, when we had the lull in the 90s, vinyl was still very much a big deal in Japan. The Japanese audiophile stuck with it. Now, we kind of had an influx to where, it kind of bottomed out in the 90s and the early O's, and now it's made a big comeback. But in Japan, it was a main source of music for years, and that lull kind of didn't occur as ferociously as it did in the United States, to where here, two-channel audio was dead. You go to a hi-fi store and it was 5.1, 5.1, home theater, home theater, home theater. High-end audio in the 90s and the early O's in the United States was pretty much non-existent. So that culture existed there for a long period of time. But like I said, it's ironic when I get these Japanese buyers and they're just, they're pilfering any great jazz, whether it's even just what we would consider more like big band type of jazz, and the stuff that's not really liked here in the United States. There's markets for it there, but they're not buying Japanese records to bring back. They're buying American records. This is what they want over there. This is, if you ever gone shopping in Japan too, you'll see now a record that might go for, you'll take an album like this. You'll see this for $50, $60, up to $100 in the United States. Over there, this is like $20, $25. You will not find a US pressing or a UK pressing of that record in Japan for that amount of money. Now you might say, well, it's because the Japanese are paying more for something that they can't get, or it's a little bit harder. But I reject that. I mean, the Japanese buyers are buying the better sounding records, and they know what the better sounding records are. They're not the Japanese pressings. When you go to like some of these audiophile lists, the Absolute Sound, and you listen, you look at the TAS list, and these are like, and this list has been ever changing for 34 years. I'm trying to think if there's any Japanese pressings of a record on there. I mean, there's a lot of classical titles, a lot of jazz titles, but they're American pressings or they're British pressings. They're not Japanese pressings. The big audiophile reviewers, they're not into the Japanese pressings. The guys who've been doing this for 30, 40 years, they're not into the Japanese pressings. I find the people that are buying the Japanese pressings are guys with collectors. I mean, I've got hundreds and hundreds of Japanese records. Like I said, you get to the point where you get a lot of something like, the wall there, I've got just on the shelf here 30, 40 copies. You're going to want to hear what that Japanese record sounds like. You're going to want to hear what it's all about. So a lot of times Japanese records are bought by collectors. I find a lot of people that are newer to vinyl buy Japanese records. Because if you haven't been doing this long enough to where you remember a time where certain records were pristine and they played like they were new from the packaging, you get that Japanese pressing and it's clean right out of the packaging. You don't have to go through 10 copies of an album to find a clean, quiet one that hasn't been abused. So it's real easy to buy it, especially as a noob. Get the Japanese pressing. It sounds clean, quiet, right out of the packaging. But again, when you start spending gobs of money on a high-end audio system, you've been doing this a while, and you spend the time to find the real clean, quiet pressing of an American pressing or a UK pressing. You go out and you spend the time, you find those clean, quiet pressings, you got the gear that can get the most out of them, and that's when you really hear the difference. So, like I said, the Japanese pressings, I'm not a big fan of them, but I didn't want to dump on all Japanese pressings. Some of them I am a fan of. This is actually a really good Japanese pressing here. This is the Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here Mastersound copy. certain albums really benefit from the Japanese way of making records, and this is one of them. That really clean, quiet vinyl makes a difference on an album like this. There are some times that the Japanese records are better, because there's a lot of times where the Japanese pressing coincided with, say, a rock record from the 70s, to where it was done so poorly and so cheaply on the crappiest vinyl that the only other option would be a Japanese pressing, and a lot of times it sounds good. But when you deal with more of the audiophile titles, now this is kind of the exception. This is a really good, this might be one of the best sounding pressings of this album, but certainly the version I listen to when I'm listening to Wish You Were Here. But when you get to certain albums that have been done a zillion times, you know, audiophile type albums, I don't have any here, but say like, you know, Steely Dan's Asia, or albums that have been done to death, Dark Side of the Moon, you know, albums that have a large quantity of pressings tend not to benefit from that. You know, that Japanese pressing doesn't shine like it does in certain scenarios where there may be only 2 or 3 other options. So sometimes when there's only a few other options, and those few other options are not that good, the Japanese pressing does win out. But a lot of the videos I talk about, I'm talking about iconic records that have been done to death. You know, when I'm talking about some of these reviews, it's Pet Sounds, it's Dark Side of the Moon, it's Led Zeppelin records. These records have been done many, many times. You go to the Discogs page and there's 500 versions of these albums. So a lot of times the Japanese pressing doesn't shine as much as it would on an album that maybe got 1 or 2, 3 different pressings around the world. So again, I'm kind of rambling off here. There's a lot to kind of digest, but again, I'm not a huge fan of the Japanese records. When you're new to this and you're just getting going, there's a lot of benefits to the Japanese pressings. But when you get fanatical and you spend gobs of money and you got the equipment that can hear what's in those grooves, the mix, the mastering, the overall presentation on the US and UK pressings, it's just better. And that's my 2 cents on it. Not been a fan of the US, Japanese pressings for a long time. Don't see that changing anytime soon. But all right, guys, until next time.